The year 1776 will be remembered for two different things. One is the birth of the United States, a country that would go on to become the largest economy in history proportionally in the 1950s. The other is a book written by Adam Smith called The Wealth of Nations, detailing the ways in which an economy can develop and grow its own wealth. So perhaps it's slightly ironic that for the first 150 years of its history, the economic policy of the United States was the exact opposite of the recommendations of Adam Smith in the book The Wealth of Nations. In fact, the book inspired one of the founding fathers of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, yes, that Alexander Hamilton, to write one of his own books on the subject, called Report on Manufactures, which was in many ways an anti-Wealth of Nations. In the book, he criticizes free trade based on the idea that no country has ever and will never practice it fairly. An excerpt from the book states, "If the system of perfect liberty to industry and commerce were the prevailing system of nations, the arguments which dissuade a country in the predicament of the United States from the zealot pursuits of manufactures would doubtless have great force. But the system which has been mentioned is far from characterizing the general policy of nations. The prevalent one has been regulated by an opposite spirit. The consequence of it is that the United States are to a certain extent in the situation of a country precluded from foreign commerce. They can indeed, without difficulty, obtain from abroad the manufactured supplies, of which they are in want, but they experience numerous and very injurious impediments to the emission and vent of their own commodities." According to Alexander Hamilton, not only would free trade with Britain keep the United States economically dependent on the British Empire, it would also delay the growth of manufacturing which was required to keep the large and ever-growing population of the United States employed. He would go on to state, "In such a position of things, the United States cannot exchange with Europe on equal terms, and the want of reciprocity would render them the victim of a system which should induce them to confine their views to agriculture and refrain from manufactures, a constant and increasing necessity on their part for the commodities of Europe, and only a partial and occasional demand for their own, in return, could not but expose them to a state of impoverishment." It's statements like these that have led some to call Alexander Hamilton the father of modern protectionism, even though he developed a lot of his ideas from the French statesman Jean-Baptiste Colbert. While he did have support in the United States, both Presidents Thomas Jefferson and President James Madison were opposed to the economic policy of Alexander Hamilton. Eventually, Alexander Hamilton would be proven to be correct when in 1807 Thomas Jefferson placed an embargo on all foreign shipping as a response to French and British pressure on American sailors during the Napoleonic Wars. Thomas Jefferson had hoped that the embargo would give America economic and political leverage. The only thing it did do was hurt the American economy. Not only did the embargo show the weakness of the American economy, it led to an increase in tensions with Britain that resulted in the War of 1812. After the war, the economic policies of Alexander Hamilton had a new advocate, Senator Henry Clay, who had also given it a new name, the American System. This American system would have three tenets, one of the main ones being opposition to free trade. And 4 years after the War of 1812, the United States passed the Tariff Act of 1816. This was the first tariff act which was explicitly targeted at protecting American industries from foreign competition. The number of tariffs and their size would keep increasing until 1832, when a compromise had to be found. While high tariffs were popular in the industrial North, they were much less popular in the agricultural South. So, to prevent civil war, in 1832 the United States reduced tariffs significantly. Eventually that civil war happened anyway, and then Abraham Lincoln, who campaigned as an old Henry Clay tariff Whig, was able to implement the American system fully as all opposition had now gone. As soon as Abraham Lincoln was elected, his government tripled tariffs, and they now stood at an average of 47%. Abraham Lincoln was very much of the belief that any abandonment of these policies would be disastrous for the American economy, as he would go on to state, "The abandonment of the protective policy by the American government must result in the increase of both useless labour and idleness, and so, in proportion, must produce want and ruin among our people." Lincoln also focused on other aspects of the American system that was advocated by Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay, including the government subsidy of infrastructure and the creation of a domestic financial system. Henry Carey, a leading economist and chief economic advisor to Lincoln, would add two more policy points to the American system. One, was public subsidy of research and education, and 2 was a rejection of class struggle in favour of a harmony of interests. Both Carey and Lincoln believed that the only way for the United States to truly achieve independence from Britain would be to leave the gold standard and reduce its reliance on British capital. The United States would continue to adopt the American system throughout the 19th century. It was at this time that economic historian Paul Bairoch would refer to it as the mother country and the bastion of modern protectionism. So what did the United States have to show for a century of disobeying the gospel of Adam Smith? Well, after starting the century as an economic backwater, it was now the largest economy in the world, practically self-sufficient in all its needs. What's also interesting to note is that the British colonies that remained part of the British Empire, like Canada and Australia, had remained economically dependent on Britain, just as Alexander Hamilton had predicted. But now that the United States had become the most competitive economy in the world, the reasoning behind the American system had lost all justification. So beginning in 1893, with the election of the first Democrat since the end of the Civil War, Grover Cleveland, the United States began its move away from the American system and towards becoming the preeminent advocate of free trade in the world, replacing the British Empire. The election of another Democrat president, Woodrow Wilson, would help to reduce tariffs even further. This had created another problem, as throughout the whole 19th century, tariffs had been one of the main sources of revenue for the US government. And so it was that in 1913, the United States passed the 16th Amendment to the US Constitution, which allowed for the levy of income taxes to replace those lost due to lack of tariffs. But the American system was not dead, and with the election of the Republican President Warren G. Harding, the US started to reintroduce tariffs in 1920. The Great Depression would also reduce confidence in this new commitment to free trade, and in 1930, President Herbert Hoover would pass the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which would increase tariffs for about 20,000 different products. But this wasn't to last, and after the United States emerged victorious from World War II, with its industry almost unscathed, it became obvious to everyone that it was now the preeminent economic superpower on the planet, and its commitment to free trade was now total. There was an ironic twist here, as Henry Clay had originally named the American system of protectionism in response to the British system of free trade, and just as the Americans were now adopting the British system of free trade, on the other side of the Atlantic, the British were now adopting the American system. Once the British realised they were now no longer the largest economy in the world, it became obvious that they now also needed to protect their domestic manufacturing from superior and more efficient US manufacturing. This resulted in the Import Duties Act of 1932, which brought an end to a century of commitment to free trade for the British Empire. The United States, on the other hand, was having no such issues, and with its newfound confidence in its economic strength, Richard Nixon would finally bring an end to the American system by reducing tariffs to an all-time low in the 1970s. As the United States had decided to adopt the British system of free trade, it was now ready to adopt one of the sons of the British Empire as one of its own. After almost 200 years of doing the exact opposite of what Adam Smith had advised them to do, Adam Smith was finally popular in American schools. Not only was Adam Smith now popular, a whole new generation of free trade advocates was now populating American intellectual discourse. Arguably the most famous of these was Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, who in 2013 was referred to by the Wall Street Journal as the most revered free market champion since Adam Smith, would, much like Adam Smith, spend most of the 70s and 80s traveling the world promoting free trade. Milton Friedman visited China multiple times throughout the 80s, and much like Adam Smith's suggestions to the United States, Milton Friedman suggested to China that the only way for them to economically develop would be through free trade. And much like the United States' response to Adam Smith, China did exactly the opposite. The love affair of the United States with free trade would run short in 2012 when they would lose the title of largest economy in the world to China. 4 years later, they would elect the most protectionist president in 100 years in the form of Donald Trump. While the economic policies of Donald Trump may seem weird when considered in the context of the last 50 years of US economic policy, when considered in the last 200 years of US economic policies, they are absolutely predictable. It's little wonder then that after the election of President Biden, the US would maintain these protectionist policies that were started by Donald Trump. and President Biden would refrain from following the footsteps of previous Democrat presidents like Grover Cleveland in their attempt to overturn the policies of their Republican predecessors. The future of American trade policy is also quite predictable, as to the extent that China gains a lead over the US will increase the tariffs and increase its protectionist policies. And were the United States to overtake China again as the largest economy in the world, the United States would go back to being pro-free trade, pro-Adam Smith, and pro-Milton Friedman in its economic policy.